There. Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Dan Winter, as you know, and this conversation is about the spiritual physics of alchemy. Can you hear me okay?
Kind of. Huh?
Is our sound okay?
Hi, Dan. Yeah, your speaker. Yeah, replay with the sound. Hold on. That's like
Testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2.
Yeah, we good. Go ahead.
Okay. So the conversation is about the physics of alchemy and the significance of that. Many of you know that I have for years been teaching about the meaning of alchemy in terms of its semantic origin, even as a term. Alchem comes from the Sumerian root al, or el mean phase shift or translation of vorticity, quite literally, which would apply to the golden spiral. And then chem, K-H-E-M, even in Egypt, meaning from the place of the blackness. So alchem as in the phase shift into access to a black hole. Literally, how do you reach a black hole? And this then leads us to the meaning of implosive collapse of charge that gives you access to a black hole, and everything that implies in terms of perception. So our original work in physics here, and I'm going to put a screen share on just 1 second here. Share screen. I'm going to show you this, share your entire screen. Start. So my new book called Fractal Spacetime, The Origin of Biologic Negentropy, starts with one basic equation. I'm hoping you can see this. This is the equation on the back of my book here on the right, and it is simply these multiples of the golden mean ratio times the Planck length and time, producing a caduceus, a cascade, a collapse wave called phase conjugate negentropic implosive collapse. And those frequencies around 2.78, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8, and 19 are exactly golden ratio exponents of Planck length and time. And very closely, as you can see in green on the bottom, almost imply the 3, 7.8, 3, 14, and 20.8 Hertz frequencies of the Schumann resonance, which is clearly an implosive negentropic collapse wave similarly. So this basic physics starts with a pretty simple picture here. Let me see if I can find it. If we start with this, here's this red circle you see here. And this red circle, visualize the symbol for the Tao, is the wavelength of Planck, the Planck length and time. And we do simple whole number golden mean exponents, multiples thereof, and we get this caduceus wave shape, which as you see here is a nested dodecahedron. And from the top view, it's this spiral nest of pentacles, which we then proved is in fact the radii of hydrogen and the origin of all biologic negentropy. So in fact we say that this is the smoking gun of what is the origin of all negentropic centripetal forces, including the gravity. And this is the picture here. This is the top-down view of hydrogen. Here's radius 1, 2, and 3, which my new equation predicts exactly. Planck times golden ratio to the 116, 117, and 118 power predict very exactly the 3 major radii of hydrogen. This is the smoking gun that proves this golden ratio, implosive collapse, is the reason for the existence of hydrogen. And with my friend and co-author Mark Rohrbaugh, who used this Planck sphere beginning, and also Nassim Haramein's work, which included the golden ratio as the universal scaling, he wrote a new equation for the ratio of the mass of electron and the proton. And so in effect he says this indeed proves a phase conjugate model, that the proton exists because it's embedded, literally fractally, in the electron, literally a black hole. And this is in parallel to what Nassim has been saying about the Schwarzschild proton as a black hole. So what does this have to do with alchemy? Well, first, these articles I've been referencing here, this is fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity, which is this new theory of gravity based on phase conjugation. That this implosive collapse of charge, literally a fusion force, is the reason that gravity exists. Now I'm going to put my beautiful face back on here just 1 second. Oh, I guess you can see me in the side. That's okay. So, let me tell you a little story about alchemy. Now, this geometry, which is basically the fact that golden mean ratio optimizes what's called the conjugation of phases, which is to say adding and multiplying of waves. And by doing that, it creates this centripetal and negentropic force. That in fact black holes would then be phase conjugate and therefore negentropic, which is to say self-organizing. They would spit out increased order exactly like a phase conjugate mirror does in optics. And so there's many implications here, one of which, for example, is that this theory of gravity predicts that what comes out the center of gravity and the center of black hole is light that's been accelerated through the speed of light times golden mean ratio multiples times the speed of light. And very interestingly, the theory is in fact confirmed by the work of the famous scientist Professor Raymond Chow here, whose extensive measurements of wave velocities faster than the speed of light concluded that the most common measurements are between 1.5 and 1.7 times the speed of light. Hint, 1.618 golden mean ratio times the speed of light is in fact confirmed by measurement, which then confirms this theory of gravity. So now on to our stories of alchemy. The most famous story of alchemy here is, I'm going to put my face back on here a little bit better. The most famous story of alchemy here comes from John Dee and Kelly, who, as far as I know, the gold they made with alchemy in Prague, as measured by the British Royal Society, was the purest gold that had ever been made on the planet and measured to that point. Now, John Dee's expertise was in the mathematics of what's called the Hypercube. He had probably the largest library in Europe in his day and was quite a mathematician. Now, the Hypercube is essentially, you could say, a stellated tetra, or unpacked cube, or a jitterbug. And both Nassim and I agree that it's this spin path of the jitterbug from a cube octa to Ecosa. I'm sorry I didn't bring my model out today. that's onset, accounts for the onset of superconductivity. But what Dee and Kelly talked about in their time, and I had the opportunity to work with my partner Vincent Bridges extensively on this, who wrote extensively, was that the circumstance for the practice of alchemy was consistent with this new physics we have. Specifically, they claimed that the Kaaba stone of the Muslims, the Kaaba stone of the Muslim church, which is famously related to golden mean ratio, which is well known to have been a glass meteorite through which was propagated a vaporized platinum group metal. When you vaporize like a gold through a glass that is molten at the proper temperature, which is what happens to a meteorite, you create a sandwich foam geometry in the glass, which is called a phase conjugate dielectric, similar to the way the Templars famously made the dark red-purple glass of the stained glass cathedrals. That this glass was so dark that unless you were turning your head, you would think it was black, but in fact it was a deep purple or blue-black, or it had a reddish tinge. And this is what happens when you vaporize gold through glass, which is the only metal that survived the high temperature impact of the glass meteorite. Now, at a certain time in history, the Kaaba stone was owned by what's called the Mad Caliph, who allowed approximately half of its volume to be ground up and used by the alchemists. And this is documented historically. And that powder was called the projective powder, or the philosopher's stone, because of its electric qualities. Now later, when this ran out, Dee and Kelly found that the Moldavite on the streets of Prague had some of the same quality. So what is a phase conjugate dielectric? A dielectric refers to the quality of the insulator between the plates of a capacitor, such that if you hit a capacitor with a voltage like a hammer, and it rings like a bell, you measure the resonance, and the efficiency of the resonance of it ringing like a bell is a measure of the quality of the dielectric. So if if the constant value, the quality of the dielectric, the insulator between the plates of a capacitor, visualize a chicken egg or pine cone, if the insulator has the right quality, then when you ring the bell, which is to say the capacitor, the bell can ring with more energy than the hammer with which you hit it. And so if a dielectric is high enough, then that capacitor, which is say that ringing bell, is by definition a vacuum coherence zero-point energy device, as is a pine cone or a chicken egg, or as is the cobblestone, as is the magical capacitor. It's an implosive zero-point energy device. And this is a clue to why you need very high dielectric materials for your house and your clothing. Hemp is a good example. It's actually the capacitor we use to measure life force, hemp fibers. So what Dee and Kelly were doing was they would take some of that philosopher's stone, that white powder, and they would mix it up into a size about the grain of rice and dip it in wax, which was a wetting agent, because then when it was dropped into the red-hot molten mercury in the chalice cup, which later was proof that they succeeded, it would allow the electrical propagation of the conjugate dielectric, the implosive dielectric field. Visualize pine cones kissing noses. This extended dodecaecosa matrix would then radiate through the gold. Now there were other issues. The gold needed to be at the center of a long wave of the similar coherence. For example, Nostradamus's tower was at the center of a giant pentagram, as was the tower in which Dee and Kelly worked. And Nostradamus also similarly, using a time reversed mirror, how Nostradamus used his scrying water, at the bottom of the cup there was a phase conjugate dielectric, a black mysterious reflector, literally a phase conjugate mirror, and that's how Nostradamus saw the future. So this is an introduction to a history of alchemy. Now, in modern times, we have more mathematics to go with this, and again, I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to show you an example of some equations that we wrote for a project called metals morphosis. Now, this project was funded from Brazil, and we have one lab in South Spain and one in Canada, and I'm going to show you here an example of those equations, and this is credit Bill Donovan. He was modeling the difficulty of achieving stability in the isotope transitions, which is to say phase conjugate collapse of nickel to copper, which he was studying the stability problems that Rossi was having with his cold fusion work. And fusion is another name for alchemy, implosive collapse. And he proved at length that Rossi would never get stability unless he selected the more difficult isotopes of nickel, 59. Otherwise, he'd have radioactive isotope intermediaries, which we believe he does. But at any rate, there's a famous work in alchemy done by a guy named Joe Champion, who predicted the temperature to create exact isotope transitions, which is to say alchemy or transmutations. But Bill went much further, using the atomic table with much more sophisticated calculations, and calculated the frequency and the temperature to catalyze isotope transitions, hundreds of them, almost every commercially useful isotope transition in the atomic table, which is of tremendous commercial value, obviously. And the proofs of this we're doing with phonon, and we're also doing it with plasma. And I'm showing you an example here of a spreadsheet which actually is hundreds of pages long. So the point is that we do know the physics of alchemy, and the physics of alchemy is to find the non-destructive, which is to say embedding fractal phase conjugate collapse path to allow the non-destructive transition of the charge inertia, called mass, between electron shells, which is to say alchemy, fusion. Now, I want to take this in a psychological direction now, because I think the best way for us to understand this is in more human terms. And I want to show you a device that we're building. It's called the Therify. I'm going to therify.net now, and I will show you, here is the device. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit here. This is the plasma tubes. We're using two opposing plasma tubes. Now if you take those two plasma tubes, and here you can see them a little better, And we fire them with this phase conjugate implosive broad spectral collapse wave here. Now this is the famous Priori device reinvented since I've discovered the physics principle, which is already successful in shrinking tumors and cysts and healing wounds and many. The Priori device was famous for that. You can read about this at therapy.net. We launch in 3 countries this month. We have productions in Brazil, in Canada, and Australia, and we're launching in the US, in Atlanta, in South France, and in Belgium this month, actually, these prototypes. But you see this 2 opposing phase conjugate plasma tubes here. This is a noble gas, which is called a phase conjugator, similar to the lithium niobate in the Star Wars. Then the low frequencies are modulated by the equation in my book, which is the principle here, that you have broad spectral phase conjugation, 180 degrees out of phase, and you create an implosive zone in the middle, which is very centripetal, which is why it is the opposite of cancer, effectively. You see, here's a short introduction to the biophysics of cancer. Let's see if this picture is visible here. This is, and again, we're looking at therapy.net, but if we look at what's happening in the living cell, the incoming food is a relatively longer wave, and then the cell subcellular organelles massage the envelope of that long wave of food to shorter wave DNA precursors, and ultimately to very high quality ultraviolet light blue fire, which is really the mechanism of the DNA itself as a waveguide. So in biophysics, you could say quite literally that high quality ultraviolet light, which is the result of alchemy in the cell, is the product of cell metabolism. Any biophysicist will tell you that high quality UV light is the driver of cell metabolism. Well, more than that, if the cell assembles its UV blue fire, its sex juice, and there's no place to go with it, then obviously it goes into replication, premature, which is a cancer. Whereas if there is permission to touch and there's a way through the membrane for the ultraviolet, which is how you define cancer, that if contact does not inhibit replication. So a way out for the blue fire, the UV sex juice, is the go, no-go moment for cancer. Well, now what the therapy does, what the Priori did, this implosive plasma, it creates an implosive path through center called alchemy, which then allows a way out through the speed of light for that phase coherence. And that's why if you have a source of Bliss, for example, which is implosive, you are not likely to get cancer. And that is where I'd like to go with this conversation. So now I want to take you to this article we put together called A Phase Conjugate Model of Perception. And this is, now we're going to be talking about alchemy inside your head. So on the right here, let's see if I zoom in just a little bit more. Yeah, there we are. On the right here, I have this equation on the cover of my book, which, remember, Planck length time times multiples golden ratio exactly predicts, not just the radii of hydrogen, exactly predicts the 2 frequencies of photosynthesis, and there's only 2, exactly predicts almost exactly the duration of the Earth year and the Venus year, and almost exactly predicts the frequencies of the Schumann harmonic cascade, and it also predicts the wavelength of adenosine diphosphate and triphosphate. And since the Schumann harmonics are also here on the left, the frequencies of the brain wave associated with human bliss, peak perception, implosion in the head, alchemy in your brain. You see, this is the story that we tried to tell the other day here, and let's see if we can do a better job of telling this story today. Visualize here, this is a little graphic to go with this, but visualize the right and left hemispheres of your brain as these 2 red waves of this opposing caduceus here. This is a Holy Grail kind of picture. Zoom in one more time here. Now, if you rotate this, you've seen my animations of the physics of the Holy Grail. This is a golden mean spiral in 3D revolved, and you have this cup within a cup, the Grail cup. But now, what we've learned about your brain waves is your right and left hemisphere are making a golden ratio called phase conjugate harmonic series, alpha to beta, which is golden ratio harmonic cascade called phase conjugate. And we learned something more, that the right and left hemisphere, just like the prairie, need to be exactly 180 degrees out of phase. Now we know this because, for several reasons, of course, we know that focused human attention causes electric fields to implode or compress. This is Bill Tiller, the famous physicist's work on conscious acts of creation, the title of his book. So focused human attention causes charge to compress. It's well proven. I'm the first one to explain why that is so, and the picture is in front of you. It's alchemy inside your head. Another example of this is when Ingo Swann so famously heated a thermistor at a distance with his mind. He caused a temperature sensor away outside of his body to heat in exactly the same way the Cherokee and the Bonpo test their initiates to see if they can light a flame with their mind, which is plasma interferometry. It is the physics of the holy light of Jerusalem, for example, where in certain caves in Jerusalem where they believe God has arrived, but in fact it's a cold flame that occurs, and we know that the archaeoacoustics of those cavities is phase conjugate, exactly like what's happening in your brain, which is called plasma interferometry for plasma containment. And if the fusion people understood this, they could save a lot of money at CERN. Okay, and so what happens is when the golden ratio harmonic cascade in the right and left hemisphere are golden ratio and 180 degrees out of phase, your mind produces a longitudinal or compressible electromagnetic, which, you know that sound waves are longitudinal, incorrectly called scalar sometimes, but electromagnetics are very little understood in their longitudinal expression. A longitudinal is a compressional wave like this. And the longitudinal component of electromagnetic field, being phase conjugate triggered, is faster than light by definition and will go through about anything. And that is the point, because you see, when Ingo Swann lit the flame with his mind at a distance, he did so through a Faraday cage, meaning it was not transverse. No conventional electromagnetic would go through a Faraday cage. No, you could do plasma containment inside a steel vessel if you understood longitudinal interferometry, which is what the flame in the mind is. Now, this sounds pretty abstract to you, I'm sure, but I'd like to give you an example. We were measuring, I had been taught, here's the animation here on the right. This is our measurement of a lady in Australia. It's on the right here. This is in green the alpha, in purple the beta, and this is 1, 2, 3, up to 5, 4 and 5 harmonics in her brain waves in golden mean ratio. Now, this is my Bliss tuner invention, and you can see this article we're discussing now is fractalfield.com/conjugate perception. There's two twin articles, conjugate gravity and conjugate perception. Those are the two subjects of today's conversation. Now, the history of this work is, and I'm going to put my face back on now. Let's turn off the screen sharing. The history of this work is my training in, of course, I invented heart coherence with heart biofeedback, my heart tuner invention, which is now heartsring.com for iPhone. But my teacher for brainwave biofeedback is a wonderful guy named Marty Woodkey from Atlanta. I think it's neurofeedback.us, I think. Marty Woodkey in Atlanta. And he helped me understand about addiction and bliss in brainwaves, and this I'm going to refer to as alchemy. Let me explain. What we believe about addiction was that addiction was a wrong turn on the right road of the wish to achieve some kind of bliss experience. That effectively, if your body achieves the kind of bliss experience, then you achieve charge implosion, and that means you become your own source of charge and therefore your own source of information, and you're no longer a parasite. And also we demonstrated that biologically bliss is an imperative in the sense that that's how you get an immune system and get the kind of aura which is coherent enough to take through death, and we have measurements for that. So The need to have bliss was functionally the definition of culture. And we joke about that, you know, the definition of culture is not your shoe polish and your wine. No, the definition of culture is, do you know how to teach your young people how to have a bliss experience? If you do, you have culture. By that definition, which is a good definition, the Aboriginals and indigenous peoples had culture, and Western people and Western religions, for the most part, do not have culture because they do not know how to teach young people how to have a bliss experience, which is specifically about charge acquisition. As Celestine prophecy correctly said, all human interaction is about charge. So what we learned was, supposing you have a beer drinker, a classic Southern beer drinking alcoholic, and you take him into the biofeedback lab and you show him how to make this alpha in their brainwaves. Well, once, you know, it can take a few sessions and you play around, give them some biofeedback cues, and it's all a fun little game. You do this with kids, so it works great. But what Marty discovered, and this is the point I wish to make, was that on the same day you have taught, using biofeedback, this person who was addicted to beer, on the same day you taught them how to make alpha in their brainwaves, this Schumann 8 to 10 hertz Bliss trigger. On that day, their next taste of beer will make them feel sick. They won't want it. Get that? Biologically, the beer, or the alcohol, was serving the need by reducing oxygen content, increasing conductivity, allowing the brain to get the Schumann harmonic cascade, and thus achieve this charge experience, a bliss approximation. But now we learn something more about that. This is, by the way, 70% documented sustained success against hard addiction using biofeedback, much better than methadone and all the other chemistry. This is Marty Woodkey, it's good work. But there's something more to this. And this is the Deep Alchemy. You know, with my Bliss tuner brainwave invention, I was measuring people's, you know, alpha brainwaves for years. And, you know, mostly meditators are good at making alpha. And people can make alpha with their eyes open, an alpha and a beta. Often can have lucid dreams with their eyes open. It's amazing stuff. But anyway, what we learned was, and I took a toll. I took a poll. I asked everybody, you know, I said, if they were very good at making alpha frequencies in their brain, or if they were very bad, I always ask this question. I said, when you close your eyes, inside your head, do you see light or do you see dark? Pretty simple question, right? And the answers I got proved my hypothesis. Because when you can make alpha in your brain waves, alpha beta, then when you close your eyes, inside your head you see light. Very simple. But now if you cannot make any alpha with your brain waves, when you close your eyes, inside your head, it's dark. It's dark. Now, this means that the beer served the function of turning the lights on. It's pretty simple. Now, why would it be that inside your head, if you want to see light, you need to be able to make this alpha beta golden ratio implosive phase conjugate cascade? Well, it's very simple. Because phase conjugation, which is to say when the light, the plasma, the charge becomes implosive. And when I say phase conjugate, just imagine pine cones learning how to kiss noses. It's very simple. Vision. When that happens, the light finds a way through center. Its phases are sorted, which is the nature of phase conjugate, being negentropic by definition in optics. So what you're doing is you're creating an organ of perception, a wormhole, literally a shamanic optical tunnel, a light tunnel inside your head where these two caduceuses meet. And that is the beginning of why shamans see through the eye of tornadoes and the eye of eagle and the eye of the sun. They see through them like an eyeball because they're phase conjugate phenomena, because phase conjugation, implosion, golden ratio, is the cause of perception. So you make this alchemic wormhole inside your head and suddenly you can ride that tornado, and if it's stable, you can use it like Jodie Foster did with the dodecahedron in the movie Contact. Remember that? Navigating the lucid dream. So where this conversation goes is it says that your ability to take this phase coherence generated by bliss experience, this implosion, this alchemy around your body, alchem, black hole making, And it grows your aura. It becomes a big centripetal tornado. And that's literally what you take with you through death. Remember, in the conversations about death, the article is goldenmean.info/immortality. And in that situation here, maybe I can show some of those graphics before we finish here. Let me turn the desktop on here in just again 1 second. But there's a sequence of visions that are known to occur in the near-death experience. They're called the Hypercube form constants. Here's the shape of the aura after death, what it looks like, where it goes. Here's the 10 and 36 hour electrical moments after death, the number of hours it takes after death by measurement for your aura to leave your body. And we know where it goes and why it goes. It goes to a place of implosive charge, Castaneda's place of power, because that is the place where compression can become acceleration, and you only accelerate by golden ratio through those harmonics, and that's the only definition of the term ascension. So here is the sequence of visions famously known to be the geometry of the death experience. Well, the joke was that if you want to drive to Paris, you get a map. If you want to die successfully and navigate, well, here's the map. This is what they saw, the Hypercube form constants. They saw lattice, cobweb, tunnel, and then spiral in that order, and then it would repeat. This is, hundreds of people in these studies. We know the geometry, basic geometry of death experience. And we also know why you see lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral at death, because that's what your DNA has to do to implosively embed a shortwave braid into a long one, preparing your charge for implosive charge acceleration, which is how you then enter the collective unconscious, the communion of saints. And we're going to end this lecture with this thought about the nature of the collective unconscious and the communion of saints. We often talk about why the Hopi were so upset when the U.S. government tried to put steel sewage pipes in the old Oribe sacred burial ground of the Hopi. The Hopi were quite aware that the fractal charge circulation of the plasma memory of ancestors would be interrupted by a non-phase conjugate structure, steel. And so ancestral memory, which is tremendously survival important, would be interrupted. In the same way that Professor Korotkov, following the Kogita, where they made phone calls to ancestors, measured the fractality of the air and confirmed that fractal air is required to make phone calls to ancestors. And this is also the way the Kozyrev mirror worked. You had to place the microwave coherent metal cylinder at a ley line cross and measure the nanoteslas if you were to document the telepathy over thousands of miles, famous for the Kozyrev mirror, and Professor Korotkov did a lot of that work. So the point was that this charge distribution efficiency, called a fractal field, is the only possible mechanism for the propagation of memory after death, communion of saints, collective unconscious, telepathy, whatever you want to call it. It is the fractal field of charge distribution efficiency. What does this mean practically? This means for this alchemy to be possible, the magnetic map of your bed and your house and your backyard and your city needs to look like a rose, which is, say, fractal, in order to have this distribution efficiency. You know why Prague makes so much money, because it attracts tourists and so well, is because it's a magnetic map of Prague is a rose. So it also means, unfortunately, that if you live in a building full of metal, electrosmog, and dead air, where the ley lines are dead, most big cities, sadly, you can expect that the radio to the inner communion of saints, the ancestral memory, the intuition, all that stuff doesn't work nearly as well. And so there's a great deal of physics to understanding the hygiene for successful birth and death and communication with the ancestral memory. And this will then lead to a very big picture about where our oneness really goes. You shamanically feel your center of attention go through the center of the earth and then the center of the sun, and that's a wormhole. And at that level we are indeed all one. But that's a plasma connection, a cloud of cold charge, as it were, and which is the Holy Ghost. And that connection is only possible in certain conditions of physics, which means that the only real priests must be electrical engineers. And this is my prejudice, of course, as an electrical engineer, but I think studying life force requires this. Now, we have a new project on this, bioactivefield.com, and the educational component of that we're just launching now, Fractal University. Check out fractalu.com. We have very advanced courses in this now available, and people can begin to actually do this with our whole curriculum, many courses, and many of our associated teachers, including some of the advanced physicists like Mark, who worked with me on the Conjugate Gravity article.
Hi, good morning, Dan. This is Eric speaking.
Hi.
Hi, I want to say you have packed a lot of information in a short period of time.
That was the idea. Non-destructive compression, I hope.
It was really wonderful. And luckily I have my friends here who came down with me. Thank you so much. It's so much information, and we look forward to talking with you, and you will always have a space here to speak with us. I'm always amazed, and it's no problem you didn't bring the models out this time because there was no time. It's just, you really did it. Congratulations on jamming all this information in a short period of time. We have to go because I want to stay on time today.
Well, thank you. Blessings. It's nice to be with you.
Nice to be with you, too. We'll talk to you later.
Stay in touch, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.